So thank you first of all for everyone joining today. It's great that you've tuned into this event. I think it'll be a really interesting conversation. And as you know, it's talking about turning the Great Resignation into the Great Retention, which has been a big topic for us all in the last few months, I think. So for those who don't know, my name's Caroline Gruen. I'm an associate partner and board member at Milk and Honey PR. So Milk and Honey is a 5-year-old agency. We specialise in reputation management and storytelling, and very much focused on high growth companies. So just to say from the front, Milk and Honey isn't purely a B2B agency. We cover B2C, financial, digital, and so on. But B2B is a really big part of our client list at the moment, and lots of good clients in that space. So my personal background is much more B2B focused across sectors. So a bit of time in Department for Business, so central government, some agency background, charity government, charity experience, and obviously back in agency now. So I became chair of the B2B Group just over 2 years ago when I was still working at weve in the B2B team there. And I'm joined today by my co-chair, Lorraine Emmett, who is MD and co-founder of ECPR. And we started working together about a year ago now, I think maybe just a little bit under that. So when we first started working together, we were very keen to get back to what should the B2B Group stand for, what do we want to achieve, and how do we want to support colleagues within the industry. And I think most importantly, we wanted to get true understanding of the issues people were facing, the opportunities, of course, and what are the things people really care about, because I think B2B is one of the areas where it does come with, a sort of number of stereotypes and so on. And we were really keen to make sure that it wasn't our own assumptions and stereotypes reflecting the topics we're covering and the work we're doing. So with that in mind, at the end of last year, we put a survey out through the PRCA, which some of you may well have fed into, to really understand the issues that matter to people in the industry at the moment. And today's event is very much based on that, because one of the learnings we had was that 73% of respondents said they struggled to recruit quality B2B talent in the course of the last year. And in particular there, and I know a number of people who, especially who support and interviewing and so on, are seeing that there's lots of competition for each candidate and that people are having lots of good quality offers. So it makes our proposition as an employer even more important than ever. So to cover this topic properly, today we're going to be having a virtual fireside chat with Alex Stevens, who's Head of PR and Communications Recruitment at Reuben Sinclair. And Reuben Sinclair is the official talent partner to the PRCA. So in this session, we're going to be talking about some of the challenges and best practice for us as employers, and some of the opportunities associated with recruiting B2B talent. And in particular, of course, how that's changed over the course of the last 2 years, because the landscape has obviously shifted a lot. So Lorraine is going to lead some of the questions with Alex, and after that, there'll be the opportunity for everyone to chip in, ask any questions that they're interested in hearing responses to, and anything that's on your mind. So I'm just going to give a quick intro to both Lorraine and Alex, and then I will hand over and we'll get started. So Lorraine, as I mentioned, is founder of Emmett & Churchman, which is known as ECPR. Lorraine's formative professional years were spent in the Saatchi Group, working on global advertising brands. Here she learned about the principles of persuasive communication. She specialised in working with complex technical companies in maritime, defence, cyber and transport, so right across the B2B space. And her focus is developing communication strategies that help clients to establish a strong brand reputation and equip them to meet and exceed their goals. And then Alex, as I've mentioned, is Head of PR and Communications Recruitment at Reuben Sinclair, which is a leading PR, digital and marketing recruitment consultancy, and as mentioned previously, the sole talent partner of the PRCA. So having worked in PR recruitment for nearly 10 years, Alex works with in-house PR teams and PR agency leaders to advise on all aspects of talent acquisition, from best practice recruitment processes to employer branding. Alex also offers career guidance to PR professionals from entry to board level. So I think there'll be some good and strong opinions from both, and we look forward to getting to some of those questions. So I'm now going to hand over to Lorraine and Alex to dive into them. Lorraine, over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. I suppose my starting point has got to be to put into perspective where I'm coming to for this interview, in that we are, as you said, a B2B PR consultancy, and we specialise in tech scale-ups. And last year we doubled in revenue and trebled in headcount. but we were ready for that head count the year before. It took a year for us to find the right cultural and skills fit for our first recruit. And it's just really interesting how much has changed over the last 24 months, Alex. We've all learned and experienced quite a lot. So what, in your mind, what are the headline trends that we've seen, and what are the main learnings over the last 2 years?
Yeah, huge question, because it's flip-flopped massively. So if you kind of rewind 2 years ago, right at the beginning of the pandemic, pretty much everyone, all of our clients closed their books. As soon as lockdown happened, recruitment froze across the board. No one was taking on new people. And sadly, as that kind of continued, then redundancies started to happen. People were put on furlough. I was put on furlough because of the recruitment issue. And I suppose there was just so much uncertainty, and recruitment just kind of fell off a cliff, really. But slowly but surely, that's kind of turned on its head a little bit, and now we find ourselves in the entirely the opposite scenario, and now everyone seems to be hiring, particularly in the B2B space. I don't know of any single B2B PR agency that would say no to good talent at the moment, for all the reasons that you said, Lorraine. You've got business coming out of your ears, and most people are unfortunately having to turn down, certainly on the agency side, having to turn down new clients because they can't service them. So yeah, everyone is hiring at the moment, but there is still some supply issues, I suppose, from a candidate perspective, and I think partly it's due to the tumultuous nature of the last couple of years. I think ultimately that's going to have an impact on the decision making that people are going to make. So that's always going to impact things. But I guess also people have had time to reflect, and they're looking for slightly different things than perhaps they were previously. So yeah, there's definitely a sort of a supply demand issue, particularly within B2B PR at the moment when it comes to hiring. And in terms of the learnings that we've had, I don't know whether we have learned that much. There are definitely, we're adopting slightly different practices now. Some of our clients are doing things slightly differently, but I still think there needs to be a massive shift if we're going to address the kind of the gap in the market, I suppose.
Okay, yeah. I you're right. I think we'll come on to it in a minute about what we've learned. I think there are changes in the way that we look for talent, and we have to use every channel, but also what our specification is. We've always said recruit for culture, train for skills. Yeah. And I think that's becoming more and more the case. Is that you have to understand you need a good fit. You can at certain levels, you can train the rest.
Yeah, absolutely, you can. We always say that you hire on attitude and behavior, and you tend to sort of, if you do that, you can, like you say, you can train skill set, but you also end up, people don't sort of end up leaving jobs because they can't do the job. Typically, like, that bit can kind of be taught, and you can, if people have got sort of good enthusiasm and good natural kind of inquisitiveness and curiosity, then they can kind of learn pretty quickly. But people tend to leave jobs or be told to leave jobs because of attitudes and behaviors. And so if you get that bit right, then the retention piece is relatively simple. I say that in a very flippant way. Of course it's not, but it's much easier to retain people that have the right attitude and behavior than retain people that have the right skill set, but the attitude and behavior is lacking. So I think that is a part of the recruitment, the recruitment shift that we have seen. I think people are much more open to that now, and thankfully are sort of becoming a little bit more flexible when it comes to that. And I think the shift to focus on retention, and I know that's broadly speaking what we're kind of talking about today, the shift to focus on retention has massively taken off this year. I think because of the supply demand issue, I think no company, no business owner, no hiring manager wants to be in a position where they're having to hire in such a tricky market, and they're going to have to at some point, probably due to growth, and there is also a natural level of churn that happens. But if they can keep hold of their good teams, it obviously makes that task so much easier. So retention, I think the shift to focus on retention has been a massive thing that's happened, and particularly because it's been a really hard couple of years for a lot of people, kind of mentally and financially, and there's been all sorts of things going on for everyone. So having that sort of focus on keeping people happy and keeping teams happy has been a huge priority for most employers, and rightly so. But it then means that the knock-on effect from that is that if people are feeling relatively comfortable and relatively secure and stable in their jobs, why would they look to leave? And that's the bit that you kind of need to tap into if you are hiring.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the question then comes in a logical progression from there is, what are the triggers? What are the? I don't think people wake up one morning and go, "That's it, I'm off. I'm going to change jobs." It's what are the triggers and the momentum that builds that make people want to move in B2B? And then we'll go on to saying, well, and then once you've got them, how do you make them stay? You nailed it. How do you build that family and that culture and that sense of belonging to something that you want to be part of because you're part of the fabric of that business?
Yeah.
The first bit is what's the trigger? Why do people move?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. No one wakes up one day and says, "I think I've had enough," and that's it. And they've never had those kind of thoughts before. And actually, funnily enough, when we get trained in recruitment, it's one of the first things that we get taught about is really delving down into people's reasons for leaving, because it's really drilled into us. No one wakes up and decides overnight that they're looking to move jobs. And so when people sort of say, "Oh, I just fancy a bit of a change," that it's more than that. There's always more than that. And actually, change is a big thing. It is that they fancy a change, but what is that change? Why is there that need for change there? That's what we need to kind of figure out. And I think in terms of that's such an individual thing. I think there's no sort of blanket reason that somebody doesn't enjoy their job. You can't sort of say, 95% of people have left their job because of X, Y, Z. And I know there's a lot about in sort of if you read sort of talent acquisition and recruitment and HR kind of literature, a lot of who would.
Sorry, can't say I do.
Yeah, that's just me. There's a lot about that talks about people, they leave their bosses rather than they leave their jobs, and to a certain degree that kind of is true, but it's a bit more than kind of leaving that person individually. I suppose it's a cultural sort of sense that they're kind of talking about there, not necessarily, you have a really nasty person that you're working for, because there's not that many nasty people out there that you can work for. So it's a little bit more than that. But I think the overwhelming thing is I think typically people used to kind of leave jobs because of quite sort of material or kind of sort of progressional reasons. So, a promotion ultimately, or a change in job title, or a pay rise. And actually that's something that they weren't able to get where they are. And so, you kind of had to job hop to kind of get those things quite often in the past. But now that's really changed. And as I mentioned before, I think, retention is such a hot topic for every employer at the moment. Quite frankly, they could probably get a pay rise or a promotion where they are if they're that good, and they probably are feeling relatively valued. And I know that given that so many pay rises and promotions were on freeze for a good part of 2020, a lot of them happened throughout 2021, and so that might be enough to retain some people for the next sort of 6 to 12 months. So really that's not necessarily a driving factor. We haven't found anymore. What we have found is that people are leaving for things that they just simply can't get in their current organization, and unfortunately often there's not a huge amount that you can do about that as an employer. It's one of those things, if you are a certain size and somebody wants to go somewhere bigger or smaller, you can't change that overnight. You might be able to change the reasons they think they want to go for a different organizational size. So I think then it's about having a really open conversation with somebody if they kind of do air that they might be sort of unhappy, and finding why that might be, because I think people have all sorts of different perceptions as to what the other side of the fence might look like, and we get a lot of people, as I'm sure you can imagine, from agency side wanting to go in-house, and actually when you talk to them about their reasons for wanting to go in-house, it's really funny because it's something that you might get in-house, you might get that, but you might also get it from another agency. Those reasons are quite often actually not to do with in-house versus agency. They're just sort of situational and organizational. So
and it's what's perceived to be
yeah.
like working in-house versus what it's perceived to be like working in an agency.
Absolutely. And it's the same with kind of big company versus small company. Clearly, there are significant differences between working at a big organization to working at a small organization. There are differences. But I think some of the things that people are attracted to by one versus the other aren't necessarily unique to that kind of size. But you know, ultimately, if somebody wants to go in-house and they've got that in their mind, there's not an awful lot you can do about that if you're an agency side employer, and vice versa. So I think it's about kind of focusing on what you can control, and ultimately recognizing that sometimes retention isn't necessarily the be all and end all. Sometimes some natural level of churn isn't always a bad thing, provided you're not in a situation where you can't then hire for months and months and months to replace that person, and you're then in a sort of staffing shortage. But yeah, I think having an open channel of conversation and being quite open and candid with your employees about their happiness ultimately and how they're feeling is really, really important, and genuinely listening, and being able to kind of implement change wherever possible is really key. But there are sometimes just scenarios that you just can't change, unfortunately.
It sounds like you're talking very much about it's culture, comms, and then development skills, or skills development, as being the triggers, and then also the reasons why you can arguably make someone stay for a little bit longer. Because if you don't have a more senior role, there's not a lot you can do about it if you're a certain size.
There's not, but progression doesn't come in one sort of route.
Direction.
Yeah, exactly. And I think particularly, well, actually, I say particularly agency side, but actually in-house as well. I think we are so used to seeing such linear progression from, you know, executive to manager to director, account director, and then to associate, and then director. And, you know, that's just your standard kind of progression route. And I think as an employee, a lot of PR people just presume that's the route that they will go down, and that's their progression option. And I think where companies do really well in terms of retention is when they provide alternative kind of routes for progression and alternative career paths that perhaps give people extra responsibility and give people that feeling of that they're progressing their skill set and developing their skill set, but not necessarily going from account manager to senior account manager, or then to account director. And actually those kind of jobs require a certain type of person that doesn't necessarily suit every single person within PR. And I think you can then end up kind of either halting somebody's career or losing somebody from the industry entirely, because you're not able to give them the development they need in the area that they're actually strongest in, because you're kind of forcing them to go down this jack of all trades route, as we kind of expect account handlers to be. And that's where we end up kind of struggling with retention, is not being able to kind of progress these people in ways that
it's almost it's tailoring for each person. It's what does development look like to you, and how can we help you along that path?
Absolutely. And it's not easy to do, because ultimately that requires a company or an employer to move away from their traditional structure, and ultimately, you know, if everyone in the agency said, I only want to do this part of the job, you might find yourself in a really tricky situation where you've only got people that, you know, PR people love writing typically, and you know, you
don't want to do media relations though. Don't want to talk to any journalists.
Exactly. Unlikely that you'll get a room full of publicity or press officers, but yeah, it's you can't do it for everyone. And actually, you're never going to be able to please everyone. But I think if you've got somebody that's a real standout talent, and their reason for potentially wanting to move on is because they want to focus on a particular area of your career, their career, it makes sense to try in some capacity to forge or create something that suits their skill set and make them own that, and then really give them the opportunity to kind of develop in a different area.
I think that's really interesting. How often do you think people have that clarity about what they want to do?
From an employee perspective, like the employee, probably not very frequently, and probably because they don't know it's an option for themselves. So like I say, I think we are as an industry so used to seeing that kind of linear progression, they're probably not aware that there are alternative options. And we do get some candidates that sort of say to us, actually, I really love the writing side of things, or I really love strategy, and I really love the creative side of things, and so I really want to kind of focus on that side of things. And that typically tends to happen at a slightly more senior level, I suppose, when they've probably tried out a few different areas and they get that opportunity to really see where their strengths lie. But 9 times out of 10, they haven't had that conversation with their current employer. They're coming to us because they think that that's not a route available for them where they are. And actually, I think if it were, all you need is to be able to do it for one person, to almost like set the example that there is that option there, that is a thing, or to just have open conversations with your teams to say, like, what is it that you want to do? Where do you think your strengths lie? Well, this is where I think your strengths lie, and this is where I think we could really utilize that and really make it shine. But it's, you've got to have a company that's willing to do that first and foremost, and like you said, they might not be aware of where that option is, or what their skill set is that is the bit that they want to kind of focus on or should focus on. And that comes from having a really supportive kind of line manager or senior leadership team that can kind of identify that and then make it happen.
Absolutely. Caroline, yes, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there because I think from a milk and honey perspective, I think as a smallish, well, not so small, but growing agency, I think we very much have taken that approach in terms of, well, we've got a couple on the call, sort of digital specialism, brand specialism, and even doing that down to more sort of the manager level. And I think obviously really important from the retention perspective and supporting people in developing their own career paths, but actually also as an agency, it's quite useful for us from a marketing perspective, because it does mean that we can demonstrate specialisms in certain areas. We can kind of put faces to those specialisms so that they see us on LinkedIn, they see that we focus on certain topics and so on, and that we're building out in those areas. So I think there's all round, both from the staff perspective and the business perspective, there's real advantages to being able to develop those unique skill sets and support people in developing their own offerings within the business.
Yeah, absolutely. It's and from a sort of an employer brand perspective as well, having those kind of figureheads in those areas is massively advantageous.
Thank you. And then thinking about the warning signs, I was having a conversation with a couple of our account directors this morning about what it looks like when someone is about to move. Are there signs that you can spot as an employer that someone's thinking of, they're getting itchy feet or they're unhappy? And what can you do about it?
Yeah, I think instinctively you quite often have a bit of a gut feeling. I mean, as a sort of line manager myself, and thinking about people that I've sort of managed in the past, sometimes you do just kind of get a little bit of a gut feeling that they're perhaps, and I think it comes down to quite often a sort of an engagement thing. They're not quite as engaged as they used to be. And it's much harder to tell that when you're working virtually, though. I think that's the difficulty that we've all got in this kind of virtual world. Obviously, most people are sort of hybrid now, or sort of doing some sort of face-to-face interaction. But when it's virtual, it can be harder to pick up on those little cues that you might get when you're sort of sat next to somebody in the office, when you can sort of tell that they're kind of not their head's not really in the game. But I think what's really important for employers to recognize is that that you can get a bit of a sense of whether they're engaged or not, but it might not be just because they're not engaged in the role or the job or the organization even. They might just be having a really tough time personally, or they might just have some things going on and it's a temporary situation. It might be a longer term situation, but it might not necessarily be because they don't want to be in it, and they don't want to have their head in the game. It just, there might be some things going on. And so I think the thing that you can do is not firstly not jump to conclusions and not sort of immediately assume that they're about to kind of walk out the door, because as soon as you do that, subconsciously you're probably shutting them out a little bit anyway, and sort of that assumption, probably you're distancing yourself from them, you're probably not involving them as much as you probably should do, which is only going to exacerbate the problem, particularly if it's not something that if you've got the wrong end of the stick and actually it's an external kind of thing that's causing this lack of engagement. So I think the only thing to really do is to be a bit of a human about it, and have, sit down and have a coffee and have a chat and just ask them if everything's okay. And sometimes you will just get a sort of an interview answer and a sort of smile and yeah, everything's fine. And but you know, I think just being kind of open to having those conversations and just sort of being honest about it and saying, look, I've noticed that you're perhaps not as engaged in our group meetings, or I don't know, I've asked for something to be done and I haven't heard back from you, or you know, is everything all right? And just hear them out and have that open conversation. And then it's about identifying whether it is something that you can do anything about. If it's an external thing, you know, they might not want actually for you to get involved, and they might be happy to tell you what it is, but actually they don't want kind of any involvement from work. But it might be that there is something that you can kind of help with, or it might be that they are, and actually they're not enjoying their job and they're not enjoying it. And then again, it's about working out whether that's because it's fundamentally something is wrong, or actually, you know, there is something that they're not able to get here. Like they are definitely not able to get it with you, and therefore they kind of need to go.
I think I mean what I try and do is present it as, this is what I see happening, this is the reason why I'm worried about it, how can I help change it? Because,
absolutely.
You know, you don't know what's going on inside other people's lives, but you can only offer to help, and then stand well back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or engage, depending on what's required.
Yeah, exactly. I think and I think it's a really hard balance to kind of find, because there is a line between work and professional life. Ultimately, I think those lines have got a lot more blurred when we're all working from home, and you know, physically the lines are a bit more blurred now. But some people won't want to kind of tell you everything that's going on. But even if you at least know there is something going on, you don't need to know the details of it. You can be a bit more mindful about it. And like I say, I think it's really just important not to jump to conclusions, because that's when you start then alienating people and making the whole situation worse. But yeah, I think if you have a bit of a sort of a gut feeling about something, and sort of perhaps think that somebody's not quite sort of giving it their all for whatever reason, then there probably is something wrong. But it might not necessarily mean that they're about to hand in their notice.
I think I work on the 80-20 rule. 80% of the time it is something, you know, people are fundamentally good. It's only 20% of the time that there's something over which you have no control, kind of thing. Kind of work. So we've established this quite a challenging scenario. So how are you going to sort it out, Alex? It's like, what now? How do we solve this?
I mean, if there was a silver bullet for this, then I would be extremely.
This is why we're here.
I would be on a beach somewhere, lying somewhere different, and I'd be a very rich lady. But no, it's, there isn't a silver bullet. I think there are so many different things and reasons as to why we're in the situation that we're in, that I guess, like I say, there isn't one then definitive solution. But I suppose if you think about it as a supply demand issue, take the demand out of it. The demand is always going to be there. I think the demand is thankfully, like, I mean, goodness, we've been through the ringer in the last couple of years, and thank goodness that there is so much business for agencies, and so much demand for PR generally in in-house teams. The value of in-house team has gone up as well, and I think that's amazing. But pretend that's not going anywhere, because it doesn't look like it is. So then it's about the supply issue, I suppose. And there's a couple of things here. I think firstly, you could look at it at a grassroots level and think about the supply from that perspective. And I think this is where B2B potentially struggles slightly more than its consumer counterparts, because thinking about kind of people that come into the PR industry, quite often they are attracted to the PR industry for the kind of the big kind of consumer brand kind of campaigns, and that's what everyone knows, and that's what everyone thinks is the sort of sexy side of it, and so that's kind of the route that they kind of gravitate towards. We speak to a lot of kind of entry-level PR candidates, or people that want to get into the PR industry, and it's unusual for them to specifically say that they would want to go down the B2B route. You get a lot of people sort of saying, I'm quite open to what I do, and just very generally kind of open. But if they have a specific idea, it tends to be more on the kind of consumer side of things. So I guess there's a sort of a reputational and brand kind of awareness of B2B PR in general that sort of needs addressing, which I know this is where you guys are stepping in. So well,
Caroline, we've spoken at length, Caroline and I've spoken at length about why B2B is so hard to recruit for, and we did come back to this idea that, You know, people want to work on beauty brands because they've heard of them. They want to work on fashion
Yeah.
brands because they heard them. They don't care about how they got there.
No.
It's like all the logistics and the creativity and the technology behind it that got it there. And actually, where actually intellectually it is so fascinating to work on those business challenges and problems.
Yeah. Absolutely,
Yeah.
no, it is. But I think people are, particularly at sort of that entry level, and depending on what kind of route they've come to PR or come to the decision that they want to go into PR, I guess will influence that. But if they're sort of brand new to the industry and don't really have too much of an insight into what it really involves and the kind of different options there are, like you say, they go for what they know, and they know the brands that everyone knows about, and that's kind of what they want to work on. So that's kind of the route that they end up going down. So I guess there's a sort of a supply issue in that perspective, so that the kind of entry level, grassroots level, kind of getting people into B2B PR, B2B PR, and then I suppose once you've got kind of the kind of grassroots kind of sorted, it's about those sort of slightly more experienced hires, and that's where people always, like, you know, our clients tend to come to us for help recruiting those kind of those hires, people that have been, you know, two sort of plus years experience, and that's kind of up to 20 plus years experience. But those are the people that are harder to kind of find, because everyone wants them. And I think here it's about kind of not going for probably what you traditionally always recruited for. I think that's probably the key thing, and having to think a little bit outside the box when it comes to hiring. I think, as I said, candidates at the moment are typically looking for a little bit of change. What that change looks like is very subjective and very individual, but they're not looking to make like for like moves. So, you know, if you're a B2B tech account manager, the chances are you're unlikely to move for another B2B tech account management job, because why would you? Is that job offering you actually anything sort of tangibly different to what you've already got in your current role? So they're looking to change, which means that the candidates that companies would traditionally and historically hire, they might be looking for new roles, but they probably don't want to work for you, and that's the sad reality of it. And people don't like to be told that for some reason. You know, if they are looking to move, it's probably because they want to move away from exactly what it is you're doing. Otherwise, they just stay in their current role. And so it means kind of trying to think about alternative backgrounds that people might be able to come from to kind of plug that gap. And you know, it might be other areas of PR, but actually it might be outside of PR entirely. It might be from, you know, Caroline, you were talking about the different disciplines that you now have in the agency. And actually that's a great example of where you can kind of pull in from sort of our, you know, sister industries, the marketings, the advertisings, the digitals, the creatives, journalism, another great example. Is thinking at kind of outside the box as to where those kind of those alignments can kind of happen. And Lorraine, I know last time we spoke, we talked a lot about repositioning actually what it is you need in roles. And I think so often companies go, oh gosh, we've had an account manager leave, we need to replace them with another account manager. But actually, if you think about what you need from that account manager, do you need somebody that does every single thing that a traditional account manager does? Or do you need a really great client services person? And actually, they could come from any industry. That's somebody that's just really, really good at managing clients and being a great client troubleshooter and a really great relationship builder. Or do you actually need somebody that's really, really good at getting copy out? Because actually, the gap that you've been left with is a content gap. And now you need to plug that. And so I think it's about kind of addressing the specific need, and then thinking about the parallels from other industries or other jobs that might be able to kind of plug that gap, because otherwise we're all going to be going over after the same people and they're not all going to be able to come to your specific role.
Excellent, thank you. Is there anything else you want to talk about why it's difficult to recruit into B2B? Have we covered everything?
I think so. I mean, ultimately, there's no difference in recruiting in B2B as there are in other areas of PR, really. In the only other thing that I would perhaps say is that whilst I mentioned grassroots level and the industry kind of needing to kind of promote B2B as a sort of an area of opportunity and a great kind of sector to work in, I think the other thing that employers and brands need to do is work on their own personal employer brand, to attract everyone from kind of grassroots level right the way up to kind of senior level. Because ultimately, I think, like I say, people are looking for change, and unless they know why working for you would be any different from working at any of your competitors, they're never going to come to you. So I think we're all, I mean, I say we, I don't work in PR, but PR people and marketing
Do you
people.
want to?
Okay, well, B2B in particular. As an industry, you're very, very good at PRing and branding for your clients and for your companies that you work for, but you're not so good at doing it for your own employer brand and shouting about why you are such a great place to work. And that comes down to multiple different things that you could talk about. You could talk about the actual work that you do for those companies. You could talk about, you know, the personal reasons that you might want to work there from a kind of benefits perspective and the wellness perspective. Talk about the people that you work with and how great they are and how much people would learn from them. There's so many different things that you can talk about from an employer brand perspective, but I think some people or some companies overlook this, and then expect people to just drop in their inbox when they're looking for a new job and are so baffled when they don't. And it's like, well, no one's ever heard of you and no one knows what you do and no one knows why you're different. So, you know, that's a massive thing and can really, really help employers as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And so how can brands reach the candidates they need? So my final question to you.
Yeah, so I think it is that it's the employer branding piece. I think that's that will do the work for you in the background and make it much more accessible for candidates to reach you. I think unless you're shouting about the kind of the work that you do and the place that you are to work and your culture and your purpose and all of those kind of things. And by purpose, it doesn't need to necessarily be a sort of
save the world.
Yeah, it doesn't. It could be that, you know, you've got a mission and that's your goal and that's your purpose, but people need to know about that and they need to kind of be bought into it. So I think employer branding is a massive thing. And then the other thing I think is that, you know, this is not a passive market. This is not the sort of market where you can stick up an advert and hope that people are going to apply. You have to be proactive in reaching out to candidates and put that kind of time in to sort of put yourself out there almost. And I think, yeah, relying on kind of passive advertising is not the way to go. I think it's so, you have to be so much more proactive and really get yourself out there if you want to kind of get good talent, because they even if you are looking for a new job, you probably have so many people like me, like recruiters, dropping into your inbox every single day asking if you're open to a move, that you don't really need to be on the job boards. You don't necessarily need to kind of be searching for different things. So you do have to put that out there, and even if that means kind of, you know, having regular coffees when you're not recruiting, so that you've got like a consistent kind of pipeline of people that you might be able to speak to when you are recruiting, it's such a good, valuable use of your time as a hiring manager to kind of keep those conversations going in the industry, because yeah, you never know when you might need them.
Just the one more thing I want to expand upon. You mentioned when we spoke about this before about employer value proposition, which I thought was really interesting, because I've been doing my Googling so I can actually understand what it means. So it says salary, compensation and benefits, but I would have thought that's just...
No.
You mean something more than that?
Yeah, I mean, it might comprise part of it, but ultimately your EVP, your employee value proposition, is what you can provide that no one else can, and why somebody should work for you over and above your competitors. And that might, you know, that might be with salary and benefits might come into that, and they probably do, you know, if you've got a really great benefits package, that might be a reason that somebody wants to work for you over and above anyone else. But it will also comprise of multiple other different factors, you know, your culture, your people, your clients, the work that you do. It can be multiple different things, but nailing that down and being able to articulate why somebody might want to work for you is so important. Particularly, well, from a branding perspective, obviously, if you know that, then it's much more easier. It's much easier to sort of publicize. But also, even in interviews, I think you've got to understand now that if you're interviewing for people, it's really important to kind of make sure it's a two-way process, and that the candidate knows the opportunity is and why they should want to kind of work for you, and you should be able to kind of articulate that clearly. And even from a retention perspective, like keeping hold of people is so much easier if you know why people want to kind of work for you, and you can highlight those things, and you can kind of remind people of all the wonderful stuff that you're doing. It helps massively to kind of improve cohesion within the team as well.
Fantastic, thank you. I think now is a time to open it to the floor for any questions, if there's anyone still watching. I've kept my screen really small so that I can only see the three of us.
I've traveled on for too long.
I'm going to expand. Oh, there are 19, goodness. Okay. Yes, any questions? Do you have any questions?
Can I ask a quick one while we let people compose themselves, and do feel free to put them in our good work, Bev, in the chat as well. I was just going to ask quickly, do you think, I mean, obviously the topic of today has been around how it's been harder to attract that talent in the first place. Do you think that problem is going to alleviate over the next year or so? If you're a mind reader, or sort of you can predict the future, do you think it's going to alleviate? Do you think the industry is coming up with solutions to address that problem? Where do you see it going?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a huge topic of conversation for us internally, because clearly it's an issue for us as well as it is for our clients, and unless we can kind of address it, then we're going to go out of business pretty quickly. But it's, I think,
want that.
Yeah, we predict that it will, this kind of, the talent shortage will probably be here to stay until at least halfway through this year. The first 2 quarters of the year we predicted would be pretty hard on the candidate side of things. But what we're kind of hoping is that the longer this kind of buoyant market goes on, and the more sort of comfortable people are about there being lots of opportunities out there, it will become slightly easier, because I think there is still some hesitancy from people to move, given, you know, we talked about the redundancies and the furloughs and all of that kind of thing that happened. You know, there's always going to be in the back of somebody's mind, if they're going to leave a job that they're relatively comfortable in, are they making a huge mistake, when it could be a case of, you know, last in, first out. And so I think the more confident that people become in the market, the more movement that will naturally happen off the back of that. I think, like I said, I think the supply is going to remain high. So then it's about kind of addressing the demand side of things. And I think ultimately the only way that's really going to be addressed, other than if everyone decides that they're suddenly going to up sticks and leave their current job, is by kind of introducing people from outside of the industry and identifying kind of those crossover kind of sectors. Because actually, even if everyone did decide to leave their jobs, you know, there's only a finite number of people within the PR industry, and if these roles are becoming available due to growth and due to new business wins if you're an agency, or to a more focused approach on PR and comms if you're in-house, then there are only so many people that can do those jobs. So, you know, you're going to have to introduce talent from elsewhere. And I think that's where people need to have perhaps a bit of a longer term strategy and a longer term think about where they might need to be hiring, and sort of investing time into maybe bringing people in that perhaps don't have the sort of tick 10 out of 10 boxes in terms of skill set, and actually they might need training in certain areas, or they might be slightly more junior than they initially thought, or whatever it might be, but thinking ahead so that they can factor in that time that it might need to take to bring them up to speed, rather than sort of, you know, panicking and going, oh my gosh, I need somebody yesterday. So it needs to be an exact replica of what we've already got, because otherwise they're not going to be able to hit the ground running. So I think a longer term approach to kind of thinking about talent and where that might come from is probably the best route forward.
Yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, a couple in the chat.
I've got a question from Bev Noble. Any tips for luring people over from the dark side?
Yeah,
I think she's referring to B2C.
Yeah. So I think it depends on whether you're looking at it at a granular, like individual level, or just generally attracting people from kind of B2C to B2B. Because I think if you're sort of generally looking to attract kind of consumers, then I suppose that's a little bit like what we were talking about with the sort of entry level talent, is just kind of promote how do we as a B2B PR industry promote why it's such a great place to work, and what we're doing as organizations, and I think that's almost like an industry-wide effort. I mean, as an organization, you can certainly do that on a sort of more kind of individual level, in terms of talking about the campaigns that you're doing and why they were so great, and actually the impact that they had, and the kind of the creativity that went into them, and all of those things that the consumer counterparts do. But sort of, I guess, for you on your B2B campaigns.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was just thinking, I think there's also, if we're thinking about going back to the reasons why people leave an agency, it's because of they're not getting the personal development they need, or they're finding the environment toxic in some way. And that's got nothing to do with whether it's B2B or B2C.
No, it hasn't.
I think there can be an almost a fear of this tech or engineering or defense or cyber. It's like, oh, it's really frightening. And once you get over it, it's just about knowing the right questions to ask. You ask the right questions. We'll train you what to do with it. But I think you can demonstrate to people that it is not a dark art. Although for many years I think we've wanted to present it as being so, because it makes us look more special. But now essentially it's about just really good comms, creativity, comms,
absolutely,
and an approach.
And I think on an individual level, when you're sort of specifically going after sort of an individual, or if you have approached a candidate and sort of you're trying to attract that specific person over from the consumer into the B2B side of things, it's doing all of the above in terms of highlighting why B2B is a really great place to work and all that kind of thing. But it's also offering the same opportunities to them and not expecting them to kind of, take a step back in order to go forward. Because we hear quite a lot of people, when people want to move industry sectors or are open to moving industry sectors, the thing that puts them off is the potential for having to take a little bit of a sidestep or a step back in their career, because who wants to do that in an industry where they're so in demand. So I think quite often you'll I mean, particularly the other way around, I think people moving from B2B into consumer will hear that they need to, they'll need to take a little bit of a sidestep or a step back even in order to kind of go into that industry, because they don't have the media contacts or they don't have the industry knowledge. And no one's going to move for that at the moment. No one's going to, unless they're absolutely desperate to kind of go into that. And if we're talking about kind of luring people away, they're clearly not absolutely desperate. So it's about kind of offering those same progression opportunities that they might have had in their current organization, or better, to kind of attract those people. So yeah, I think a combination of all of those things.
And look, interesting question here from Claire. Do you think agencies generally place enough emphasis on values? If they have them, do they articulate this well enough in the recruitment process?
Probably not, no. I think, I mean, it's the same across a lot of industries, not just the PR industry, really. I think values can quite often be a sort of an exercise that companies do because they think that they need to have values as an organization. And then they put them up on their wall and they put them on their website and they put them on their job specs, but then they do very little with them. And actually, we spoke about kind of hiring for attitude and behavior, and actually hiring against your values is a really good way to do that, because I think the danger when we sort of talk about hiring for attitude and behavior is that we actually accidentally end up hiring for personality, and that's a really dangerous situation to be in, particularly from a diversity perspective. It's a really difficult and bad place to be if you're kind of hiring clones when it comes to personality. So we need to not fall into that trap. And actually a really good way to do that is to hire by values, because, people from all walks of life and all different backgrounds and all different personality types, and anyone can have a similar sort of values but be completely different in every other area of their life. But if your values are true to your organization and they genuinely mean something to you, and the people that kind of meet those values would genuinely be a good fit for your organization, it's a great way to hire, because that's a really kind of proven way of working out whether they will kind of succeed with you. And from a retention perspective, the people that are kind of likely to fit in with your values are the people that are likely to stick around as well. So it's a good way to hire, but probably people don't place enough emphasis on them.
I'm just making a note.
Oh, good.
Don't want to forget that one. because we've got
the values do have to be, they can't just be, you know, sort of like I said, like a sort of an exercise that don't actually really mean anything to you.
I mean, we've developed our values, and it's always been, and it's comes directly, so Liz Churchman and I, directly from our experience of working in the previous agency I owned, is what was really important to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that kind of, and there's a story behind each one. I'm not going to go into it now, but there's a story behind each one. Speaking of the devil, Liz, if we had to do one thing tomorrow to help bridge this gap, what would you say we need to do, Alex?
Oh gosh, I mean, I suppose it depends on whether you mean as you as an agency, or you as an individual, or you as a
don't pick on me.
No, not you. But you know, as an agency, okay, fine. So I think the biggest thing I think is the employer branding and the EVP stuff. I really do. I think when we get asked to recruit by clients, the ones that we get excited about are the ones that have that really good employer brand, because it's a much easier sell, for want of a better word, when we're speaking to candidates about opportunities. First and foremost, the ones that they've kind of potentially already heard of, they're much more likely to want to go to them. And secondly, even if they haven't heard of them, if they've got a great story, or, you know, they've got a distinguished, like a sort of something that can distinguish them against all of the competitors, that's what people kind of prick their ears up and go, oh, okay, like I can see why I'd want to kind of at least have a chat with them, because I can see what I might get there that I might not get from my current company or the other person that wanted to talk to me, or whatever it might be. So nailing that part, and then being able to articulate it, whether that's articulating it to the world or at least articulating it to your recruiter, that's the really important thing, because it's about that kind of storytelling. And I always say my job as a recruiter is a kind of, it's storytelling in a kind. It's just storytelling to individual people about certain businesses, and that's really hard to do if there's no brand there to work with in the first place. And you know, it's going to help in the background with direct applications as well. The better known you are, and sort of the more you kind of shout about what you're doing, the more likely it is that you've got people coming to you, as opposed to you having to do all the hard work and going out to them.
Okay. There we are, Liz. That's what you need to do.
On your own. When I say one thing, it's not really one thing. It's a whole massive thing. It's not just saying, you know, you just need to do PR.
Thank you.
Sorry.
So the discussion around values, Rachel's asking, does hiring for values ensure a good culture fit? I think you've kind of answered that with your agency. And then what else should you do? Should you bear in mind for building a good culture in an agency?
Yeah, I guess culture is one of those those things that's really hard to define, and I think it means different things to different people as well. I think, like I say, there's a really dangerous trap that quite often employers certainly fall into when they talk to us. Or, you know, they say, oh, we really want somebody that's a really good culture fit. And actually, when you drill down into what that means, what they start talking about is their personality, and that's yeah, like I said before, it's a really dangerous place to be. So culture of a business, I think the values has a huge part to play in that, if they truly do mean something to that business, and it's sort of something that you live by, and you kind of, every decision that a business makes is in line with those values. So I think that's really important. But I suppose culture becomes so much more than that. It's not just values. That it could be, you know, how you operate and how you treat your staff on a day-to-day basis. That kind of impacts your culture. It could be the sort of the social element of your organization and what you do outside of work together and that sort of thing. That influences your culture. So culture is a massive thing. And what's important with it, we always get from candidates, so I want somewhere with a really great culture, and I'm like, what is that? You know, that could mean something. My definition of what is a really good culture for a company is probably entirely different to, you know, the next person down the road. So it's a really hard one to define. But I think values does play a big part in it. And I certainly think when people are talking about a good cultural fit and meaning personality, actually what they should be thinking about is values, because from that perspective, that will work. You know, they will fit in from a sort of cultural perspective if you're going by kind of values-led approach.
Caroline, I'm going to pick on you. You've been quiet for too long.
Oh, actually, there was another question that's come through in the chat, which I think might be worth just highlighting. So again, it was on the culture and values piece, which I think has been a really kind of key theme across this discussion. And again, from Claire, so it's more, how can agencies bring that to life? So how do you actually demonstrate that to applicants? I think you've covered maybe that in a few parts, but I don't know if there's perhaps more creative ways they could go about doing that to really prove that.
Yeah, I suppose if from sort of an employer brand perspective, if we're thinking about employer branding, there's ways that you can kind of get across the culture of an agency. And like I say, culture is such a broad word and it can mean so many different things. But if we're thinking, you know, in the more sort of traditional sense of who people are and, you know, what it's like to work there, and that sort of thing from a sort of a day-to-day perspective of not the work, but, you know, the sort of atmosphere in the job and in the office, then, you know, there's a lot that you can do from a sort of branding perspective. So a lot of people and a lot of bigger organizations have really good careers pages on their website and have a really good kind of focus on actually what it's like to work at that organization, not the work that they do, not the kind of the awards that they've won and all that kind of stuff. It's actually, you know, day to day, what is it like? What do you guys get up to? Who are the people there? Showcasing those individual personalities and talents and letting them have a bit of a voice at all levels. You know, no one wants to just hear from the CEO about what it's like to work there, because frankly, they probably don't have the same perspective as so being able to give a voice to lots of different people at all levels. And you can do the same on social media as well. You can do that sort of thing on social media, not just talk about the work that you do as an organization, albeit it might be great and it will help from an employer brand perspective, but actually people want to know what it's like to work there. So having a little bit more of the softer side of things, I think is really important. And telling those kind of nice anecdotal stories about sort of different things that have happened in the organization, and putting a human voice behind an organization says a lot about its culture, I think. So from that side of things, I think that's kind of really important. And again, it sort of comes down to employer branding to a certain degree. The other thing is, I suppose, again, it's really hard in a world where a lot of us are still kind of working virtually, but I think that there's still value in a face-to-face meeting at some point in an interview process, and not sort of expecting everything to be done virtually. And I think that can happen at a latter stage when people are a little bit more invested and there's the time that can go into that. But, you know, it's so much easier to get a sense of culture of an organization if you're in it, rather than sort of looking at it on a screen.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm conscious we only have 2 minutes to go, so it's been brilliant how many questions there's been from everybody. I think, as I say, there were really clear themes coming through there. Obviously, in terms of the fact that, you know, there is lots of opportunities for people within the industry. There's lots of interesting opportunities, and it means people have got that element of choice. But increasingly more so than ever, it's become very important to demonstrate why, I suppose, why you're a nice and an interesting and an inclusive agency to work for, or company to work for, as opposed to just necessarily going for the highest salary offer, basically. So it's been really interesting to get that sense from you and understand kind of how essential that is to absolutely everything in this process. So thank you very much for that. It was a really good discussion. Thank you very much, Lorraine, for leading on the questions, and thank you to everybody for joining. It was great to see you all. I'm sure Kerry will be circulating the recording afterwards, and we hope to see you at another event soon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you all. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.